Well, look, I think that what compounds everything here is that, we went into this crisis, especially in Canada, with virtually no GDP growth to speak of, point number one, and a massive debt buildup. And it amazes me that hardly anybody, it seems, had any savings on hand to get through even this transitory phenomenon that we're going through with the lockdown. Now, I never said it was going to be the Great Depression. That's what people seem to assume when you talk about a depression. There's been depressions for centuries. This is not the first one, but we think of the Great Depression because it was the closest one over a century ago. But, the reality is that today, Amanda, we do have a social safety net in place. We're going through bank earnings right now. They're going to take a hit with their loan loss provisioning, but in the 1930s, we saw thousands of banks shut their doors. But let me just make the point. This is not some plain vanilla recession, okay? This is a depression, and the dynamics of a depression are different than the dynamics of a recession, because a classic recession that we all grew up to understand is a haircut in GDP for 2, 3, or 4 quarters. The difference about depressions, no matter how they're caused, what depressions do is they invoke a secular change in behavior. And the classic business cycle recessions, they're pretty well forgotten about within a year after they end. And depressions, what they do is they entail a prolonged period of weak economic growth, widespread excess capacity, deflationary pressure, and we might not be seeing the breakdown of the financial system, but we're certainly going to be seeing a wave of bankruptcies. So that is, I think, how we have to realistically, set the framework here, that this is something totally even different than the last recession we had, which they called the Great Recession. They'll call this the Great Repression, but this is something totally different than the classic business cycle downturn.
And so anytime there is even that classic business cycle downturn, David, we do see governments moving in to help, right? They move in to try to stimulate. We do have, to your point, social safety nets in place so that those who do find themselves laid off or bankruptcies, there's some kind of, support for them. This time is different in the sense that certainly in Canada, there's been this feeling of there's support for everybody. Nobody should come to any harm. It was almost refreshing to hear my last guest, Mark Satov, say, so what if Air Canada goes under? As long as you have one airline, somebody will come along and replace it. It's fine. And I say refreshing, not because I have anything against Air Canada, but because it's true. People can go bankrupt. People can lose their jobs. Businesses do go under. That's the nature of how economies work. Have we lost sight of that? And is there a price to pay for losing sight of that?
Well, look, I think that we shut down call it 80% of the economy here. What's interesting is that the 20% that was still open was the essential part of the economy. So here we are, we figured out that, 80% of the economy is actually not essential, so maybe we don't even need it. And I'm being a little facetious when I say that, obviously. But there's got to be some sort of quid pro quo here. I mean, you had government officials globally, let's talk about Canada, telling people you can't work. And so what's happened here, and I think it's totally appropriate for the government for a period of time to provide the income replenishment, call it, for the disenfranchised workers and businesses out there. I think that they need and deserve a lifeline. I think that the way it's been done in such a haphazard fashion, and to tell taxpayers, we're not going to care about people that are taking advantage of the system. Well, I don't quite think that's right. But I think that the idea behind keeping people whole, at least for a few quarters, and it is expensive, there's no doubt about it, but the alternative is something a lot worse, which is called social instability. I don't think we really want to see that as a society. But my preference would be, I think people deep down want to work. They don't want to get paid to stay at home and do nothing. The beauty of the New Deal, the FDR New Deal, and we can talk, everybody debates today what the causes were of the Great Depression. But the reality is that the New Deal put people to work, right? It wasn't just we're going to pay you to be out of work, So the Golden Gate Bridge got built in the New Deal in the 1930s, the Lincoln Tunnel, the Triborough Bridge, the extension of Route 66. There were so many things that were done. Now, today's infrastructure might be different. Today, It's maybe it's cyber infrastructure or other things. So I would rather have these people that are being paid right now, even temporarily, to find stuff for them to do, in some sort of capacity, to at least provide some input into economic activity instead of paying them just to stay at home.
Make the distinction for me, though, because to your point, one of the things that is different and the reason why, nobody's allowed to be harmed here is because we have locked everything down. It was very unlike most cyclical downturns. At some point, though, as we reopen, what is the risk we run, in your view? What's the biggest risk of getting that process wrong? And we're debating this right now because obviously we're watching to see whether we get second waves. We're waiting to see whether some places that never really seem to take it seriously, like the U.S., are harmed to the rest of us, or parts of the U.S., I should say. What are you concerned about as we gradually reopen and get into what will then be the normal part of a recession?
Well, I frankly don't even think there's a normal part to the recession. I mean, look, we have a debt nation right now. I mean, we're going to get first quarter GDP on Friday. It's going to be like minus 10%, and that wasn't even the eye of the storm. The eye of the storm was the second quarter, where it's going to be more like negative 50%. So, nothing's normal here. It's going to take years, maybe 3, 4, 5 years to even get back to normal, and that's assuming that we get a vaccine. But you see, that's the thing here, is that, we're not waiting here like we were in the 1970s and 80s. Oh, once inflation declines, the recession is over. Or once, we have the savings and loan crisis in the U.S. and the commercial real estate crisis in the early 90s. Okay, once that ends, then we're going to go back to normal. This isn't a case where in the last cycle, we ring-fence the U.S. banks, we capitalize them. Oh, what do you know? TARP 2 works, move on back to normal. Nothing is back to normal till we get a vaccine. So, right, it's damned if you, damned if you don't. So, and Canada is much further behind, especially Ontario, than say they are in the States, but they're reopening all 50 states gradually. There's always a risk, obviously, of a second wave. But what I find very fascinating when you look at the data is and even in China, by the way, this is true, as the supply side opens up, as the production side of the economy opens up, demand is lagging well behind. And despite the TV pictures you get, people heading onto the beaches on Memorial Day weekend, and they're lining up to go shopping and whatever, the vast majority of the population in the surveys are showing that they are very hesitant to go out and shop like they did before. So we're going to have this huge gap between the demand side of the economy and the supply side of the economy. And the reality is that nothing is going to return to even quasi-normal without demand. So you can talk all you want about reopening the economy. The question is, when is demand going to come back? And that's going to take a long period of time. And, of course, it hinges on something that nobody has the answer to, because we're not waiting here for inflation to fall and then to have Gerald Bowie or have Paul Volcker cut interest rates and voila, we're off to a new recovery. Nothing, the only game changer is a vaccine. That's it.